This next book is one that I think I've mentioned in at least one of my other videos, when another video on maybe a book of intellectual or cultural history. This one is called The Austrian Mind, An Intellectual and Social History, 1848 to 1938, by William M. Johnston. This is a really very, very thorough account of... There is some social history in it, as the subtitle hints, but the vast majority of it is intellectual history. Almost all of it is intellectual history. So if you're interested in roughly the exactly 90 years from, the year of revolution in Europe, 1848, to right up to the brink of World War II, in what was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and then later the separate territories that was broken up into, this is really the go-to book. I'll tell you right off the bat that it's not the funnest of reads, the most fun of reads. It kind of does read like, not quite a source book, it's not that dry, but the chapters are very topically arranged, and he certainly covers all of his bases. So I'll just read you the review that I wrote, and hopefully that'll shed some more light on whether this is the kind of thing that you'll be interested in. Johnston makes a really concerted effort to leave absolutely no stone unturned in this book. He begins with a brief history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, emphasizing its frivolity, decadence, and rampant materialism, especially among the nobility. The kind of bureaucracy that we associate with the writings of Karl Kraus and Franz Kafka were only too real for Austrians, a mixture of both uniformity and indolence, or as Johnston calls them, absolutism mitigated by schlumperei. Schlumperei is the word for foggy-headedness or muddy-headedness, especially as a result of being from this part of the world. He includes sections on university life and military culture, apart from which Austrian social life would have barely been recognizable, since those two things formed such a core of Austro-Hungarian culture. Both religion and anti-clericalism were fundamental too, both in the culture and in the book. The amount of information and the number of names in this book can really be exhausting, and this coming from someone who reads books on graduate level syllabi just for fun, which is something I occasionally do. It was somewhat tiring that after around the 400-page mark, I had to set it down for a week to find the energy to make that last dash through the last 100 pages or so. None of this is to say that I didn't enjoy it. I did, and I learned quite a bit. But it does suffer from a surfeit of ambition because of the sheer number of names and ideas mentioned. It might in fact serve many people better to use it as a reference work, as I said, rather than as a book that you sit down and read from cover to cover. There are a number of problems that I have with the book. I think 6 that I listed here. The first one is that Hungarian intellectuals get about 50 pages at the very end of the book, and the only major figures that are discussed are the literary critic, Georg Lukács, and the sociologist, usually called a sociologist of knowledge, Karl Mannheim. Secondly, Johnston continually refers to people by their geographic region from which they come and their religion. And he starts sentences with words like this Silesian Jew or that Viennese Lutheran, even when their identities really have no relevance to the ideas that they contributed to the book. or his discussion of them, and that's sort of frustrating. I mean, I would, you know, hate to be referred to as, you know, that Texan atheist, or that Texan Christian, which is, especially, as I said, when it has nothing to do with the book. He refers to several figures as Marcionists, referring to the ancient writer, but only explains how they're Marcionists when he's more than halfway through the book. Another one, while his designation of many of these figures, he calls them therapeutic nihilists. And sometimes that designation is convincing, but he uses the phrase to pigeonhole some ideas into really narrow categories at the cost of investigating their true complexity, which is somewhat irksome. Lastly, as I've said before, the book reads as more of a compendium of ideas and names than a book which presents a thesis and argues for it with evidence and presents a conclusion. And lastly, there is no mistake about the focus here. It's almost, as I said earlier, wholly intellectual history. The word social could have been easily dropped from the subtitle, and would have given a much fairer impression of the kind of book that it really is. None of this should discourage anyone with a real sense of gusto for this type of history from reading it. The real meat of the book is in its really exhaustive attempt to mention and account for every aspect of Viennese, or more broadly, Austro-Hungarian intellectual history. These are just a few of the areas that he covers, and I'll mention them. Economic theory, psychology, legal theory, social theory, the history of what Johnston calls Austro-Marxism, music and music criticism, the visual arts, the writing of history and historiography, art and art history, philosophy, and not just generally, the philosophy of science, mathematics, logic, the Vienna Circle, the positivists, all of those people, religion and theology, the social trends in Bohemian Reformed Catholicism, and the birth of what we can properly call geopolitics. This book's coverage of most figures, Freud, Kafka, and Richard Strauss, to name a few, is perfectly adequate. However, it should really be most prized for rescuing dozens of names from the brink of obscurity. Of more than the 70 figures that are covered in some amount of depth, I would imagine that more than half are probably not familiar to most readers in the English-speaking world, unless you're a scholar in that field. It's proven especially edifying for me in respect to some of the literature that I've read on fascism, since this covers sort of that period of incubation for European fascism. And while certainly not a major theme, one can definitely perceive varying types of extremism forming before your very eyes as you read about some of the social and political theory of the time, especially in the sections on Othmar and the increasingly popular anti-Semitism. And if you read German fluently, the book's notes and bibliography combined run to almost 100 pages, which should provide a good place to start if you're interested in even further reading. But published in 1972 and or probably 1971, this says winner of the 1971 Austrian History Award. So definitely a book for a niche reader, but if you happen to be that reader, you'll certainly be glad that you stumbled across it. The Austrian Mind, an Intellectual and Social History, 1848 to 1938, by William M. Johnson.